What's up, STS Nation? Welcome to a special edition of Surviving the Survivor. We bring you the best guests in true crime, and then there are days where we outdo ourselves and go a level higher, and today is one of those days. Before I introduce everyone, please know that the conversation you're about to hear comes against the backdrop of the recent arrest of Brian Christopher Kohberger, who police say is responsible for the gruesome quadruple homicide of the so-called Idaho 4. As I like to start every show, and we'll do right now, let us never forget those young lives lost way too soon. Madison Mogan, 21, Kaylee Gonzalez, 21, Zana Kernodal, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20. We want to remind everyone that Brian Kohberger is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And we are now joined by our esteemed panel, our special guest. First one to introduce is Kerri Rawson. Let me tell the audience, for those of you who do not know, in 2005, Kerri Rawson heard a knock on the door of her apartment. When she opened it, an FBI agent informed her that her father had been arrested for murdering 10 people, including 2 children. It was then that she learned her father was the notorious serial killer known as BTK, a name he'd given himself that described the horrific way he committed his crimes: bind, torture, kill. As news of his capture spread, Wichita, Kansas celebrated the end of a 31-year nightmare, but for Kerri Rawson, another nightmare was just beginning. She was plunged into a black hole of horror and disbelief. The same man who had been a loving father, a devoted husband, a church president, a Boy Scout leader, and a public servant had been using his own family as cover for his heinous crimes since before Kerri was even born. Everything she had believed about her life had been a lie. She wrote the book, A Serial Killer's Daughter, from which this is extracted. It is an unflinching exploration of life with one of America's most infamous killers and an astonishing tale of personal and spiritual transformation. For all who suffer from unhealed wounds or the crippling effects of violence, betrayal, and anger, Kerri Rawson's story offers the hope of reclaiming sanity in the midst of madness, rebuilding a life in the shadow of death, and learning to forgive the unforgivable. We welcome Kerri Rawson. Kerri, you're a true survivor. My mother's a Holocaust survivor. Put you in the same category. You've been to hell and back. As far as our guest host for the evening, you probably recognize them. Dr. Ann Wolbert Burgess. They are a friend of the show, and they are back tonight. She's an internationally recognized pioneer in the assessment and treatment of victims of trauma and abuse. You know that super successful Netflix show, Mindhunters, about the FBI's first day of criminal profiling. Well, she worked with the real live agents the show is based on, and part of that is based on, of course, Ann's work herself. Dr. Burgess is author of A Killer by Design, Murders, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. And as if that is not enough, we've got Dr. Gary Bricado, PhD. He's a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he collaborates with Dr. Ann Burgess and Dr. Victor Petraka on forensic research. They've examined crimes such as murder, including serial killing, sex offenses, mutilation and dismemberment, and the insanity defense. Dr. Bricado is a member of Dr. Burgess's Super Sleuths group, in which experts from diverse forensic disciplines convene to provide consultation on various cold cases. And he, too, is the co-author of The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Violent Crime. And at this point, it is something I've never done before, but there are no two better people to do this with. I'm going to hand over the reins to Dr. Ann Burgess and Dr. Gary Bricado for a conversation with Kerri Rawson, and I will defer to Dr. Burgess first.
Thank you very much, Joel. It's delightful to be here. I am so pleased to meet Kerri. I talk about her in my class. My students are required to read parts of her book. So this is a real treat for me. And I really am looking forward to our conversation this evening. We were going to, I guess, start off with some questions that Dr. Mercado and I have spent some time thinking about. I also want to say to you, Kerri, that if you have questions for us, please feel free to ask. This isn't just for us to ask you. We'd love to answer any questions that you might have as the evening goes on. So I guess to start, maybe the best place is to look at how you're feeling about hearing about the family of this suspect that has just been identified. And what do you think they are going through, since you had to go through a similar experience back in early 2000? Do you have anything that you'd like to say for us to learn from? Because the family of an offender that's even a suspect certainly has a lot of anxiety and trauma to go through.
Yeah, so he mentioned hell. I mean, it's utter, total, upending, life-changing, altering hell. I mean, it's been almost 18 years since my father was arrested, and it's still almost daily affecting my life, my mom's life, my brother's life, you know, my extended family life. I would say the community in Wichita is still affected, the 7 families that lost members. I mean, it's a ripple effect that extends out from the main people. I mean, it's generational impacting. You know, we've lost 4 young lives in Idaho that, you know, had the potential for greatness and families. That's all gone. And Brian Koberger, if he's found guilty, his life is gone. I mean, here was somebody, you know, studying a PhD, had probably massive potential. Something went terribly wrong. And then, you know, you have his parents and his sisters completely upended, completely in shock. I mean, reportedly, there was a no-knock warrant in the middle of the night. Like, how terrifying is just that? How traumatizing is just that? I mean, I understand why they had to do it, but you're dealing with so much, because first the FBI doesn't know what you know. You know, they had to question my mother, they had to question me, question my brother. Nobody could call anybody. You know, I was in my pajamas when I was talking to the FBI agent because I had slept in, and I said, "Can I go get changed?" He said, "Yes, but you've got to leave your phone with me." You know, I just went into complete and utter shock, because he just nailed it to me on the kitchen, just dropped it. "Hey, your BTK's," like, he's like, "Your father's BTK." It wasn't we suspect or we're questioning him. He just dropped that right on me. So I was literally in physical shock, shaking for 5 days. I didn't stop shaking until I woke up the first day at my uncle's home in Kansas. I was sleeping on a mattress on the floor. And I think that morning, on Tuesday morning, when I woke up not shaking, was the first time I thought, maybe I have a chance to live through this, you know.
Kerri, I want to jump in real quick. You had a very interesting reaction when Dr. Burgess said that her students are required to read parts of your book. Did you know that?
No.
And what do you think of the fact that your story is now being taught in terms of an educational book?
Well, I mean, I know it's been taught, it's being taught in some criminology classes. I've been working quietly with some criminologists, occasionally giving lectures as I can. I have PTSD, and I'm kind of, you know, so it comes and goes. So sometimes I'll start like a working relationship, and then sometimes I'll have to bail for a season. And I feel bad about that. So I kind of, you know, I keep having criminologists come back, professors asking me in a lecture. Sometimes I have to just decline even that day, you know, but most of them are pretty understanding. In my latest round of trauma therapy last year, we did talk about limiting my repeating of the crimes over and over, and why I felt almost the compulsive need, which Dr. Burgess could probably talk about, to do that. So it's a mix of trying to continue to heal, live a normal life, be a mom to 2 kids, whatever normal is over here, and educate and try to advance the fields and add to it, plus with victimology and speaking up for families like Coburgers. So I don't know, I'm just me, so just do what I can when I can, and if I can't, then I nap.
Well, I would add, Kerri, that I really want to applaud you because I think there's been an underemphasis on the victimization of the families of people who are perpetrators. In other words, the effects that that has on them to discover that a loved one is responsible for a horrendous act. And I think it sort of broadens the understanding of the effects of these kind of crimes. And so that's really terrific. I'm also using your book, heavily quoting it in places in a manuscript I'm doing for my next book, because of the emphasis on victims. And so I think it's very, very powerful. It's interesting. There's a famous PTSD researcher named Foa, it's the last name, who has shown that trauma that is associated with things like life, like natural events, like earthquakes and storms and fires and things like that, is much easier for people to get over than trauma that is caused by other human beings. And I think one could argue is especially difficult when it is the people that we've associated and sort of encoded in our minds as being the people that are supposed to love us the most and keep us safe. And what one of the things we're going to talk about today in the questions we put together is the realization that a person could be so fragmented that they could literally live a double life, and then to discover that and how that must feel, and so that I think it might in fact be an admirable place to enter into the questions. Is what do you think about this idea of your father living a double life?
Well, I live a double life now. I live in the duplicity of drawing a line before the arrest and after the arrest. I mean, that's how we refer to it, before and after, in my family. Like, I live in the double life of my father and BTK. I argue with people, as I did in my book, like my father or police officer has a famous, I think it was a police officer, has a famous quote that he thought my father was 90% BTK and 10% Denis Rader. And I'm going to argue with you, the day is long. I knew him as 90% my father. I didn't know BTK. If I had known BTK, I wouldn't have survived. Only one person survived. That's Kevin Bright, who was the younger brother of Catherine Bright, who was murdered in 1974 after the Oteros. He fought my father and was shot twice by my father. So there's only one person I consider a survivor of BTK. Now, did I see glimpses in hindsight of somebody trying to control himself, control anger in the family, try to control the family, some emotional abuse, some verbal abuse, physical abuse against my brother twice, which I detailed in the book, with strangulation? Yes. I mean, it's hard for me now post-arrest to look at photos of my father, especially in jail clothing. I have a tendency to want to, from a trauma standpoint, disassociate at times. Like, even I have my book cover, my best-selling book turned backwards. One, so my family, my kids don't have to see it, and two, so I'm not having to stare at my dad's mug all the time on the cover. I mean, that's just sort of my reality of, if I want to look at a photo of my father, I'd rather have my family photos that are on my phone and not really have to deal with the guy post arrest, because it doesn't necessarily even always look like my father. It looks like a very angry, tired, worn out person, and there's times I feel bad for him when I see like how much he had deteriorated in jail. So I guess with the double life, I guess I sort of live in it too. I've had investigators, Kelly Otis, who helped catch my father. He'll argue with me. He's said to me more than once, every day of your life was a lie. And I get really mad at him and I argue back. It wasn't a lie to me, it was real. And I argue with educated types that want to give me the definition of a psychopath, and I want to argue back. Maybe we're not weeding these guys out quick enough or catching them or aware of them, because not just because of how well they hide, but because of my argument of how well, I truly believe my father was my father when he was with us, not BTK, that he loved us, protected us, bent over backwards for me and my brother the majority of the time, loved my mom. It's a difficult conversation and argument to have, because then people think I'm defending his actions, and I'm not. I'm just saying I don't know BTK. I've had to study his actions, and then somewhere in trauma therapy merge those back together. And so then the insane part of that is that unfortunately, with my vivid imagination, I now can picture my father walking into these homes and committing these crimes. So when we were talking about PTSD, when I stuck my nose deep into the Idaho case with the other true crime community, I can almost visualize perhaps what happened, and it sort of gets all tangled up in there between the potential suspect and my father, unfortunately. So I don't even know what that is, but
Kerri, I'm sorry, Dr. Burgess. I just want to periodically jump in with a viewer question or comment, since Kerri just spoke about the true crime community. We have one of the best. So this one comes from, and we'll just pepper a few in as we go, but this one comes from High State of Mind. Thank you for being so strong and brave, Kerri Rawson. You are such a positive inspiration for the community. We cannot imagine what you've been through. What advice would you give Bryan Kohberger's family during these times? Love and light. I know some of these might be redundant from Gary and Ann, but what advice would you give the Kohbergers right now?
Well, the FBI told us to begin with, don't talk to the media. And I was like, well, why not? And they're like, it'll make it worse. And I was like, make what worse? That's how innocent I was that first day. It's their right to talk to the media, but my advice would be not to right now until they get more ground under their feet, or even after the trial, especially because I expect this to go to trial versus my father pleading guilty. We knew by the first night he was confessing, the FBI did let us know that. So it's a little bit different when you have somebody confessing. But in a case where he needs to have a fair defense, I would highly recommend them not engaging in the media and waiting until they have something worth saying. My family felt like we had nothing to say early on, and it wouldn't have gone well. I was too angry too. So I also would recommend getting into trauma therapy yesterday. I did not for 2 years. I thought I was going insane from flashbacks from that first few hours of being notified that was stuck in my head on repeat like a movie reel. I had no idea what was wrong with me. I dragged my butt into therapy, and she read the DSM and we started working on it. So I would say just ask for help, and you've got to communicate. You've got to ask for victim services. My family didn't know they were available. Nobody offered them to them. The FBI is like, hi, bye, see you never. So you just, as a family like mine, it's rare to get help, I believe, to be offered victim services. I honestly wasn't offered them till a couple years ago when I needed them with an issue with my father, and that's because I reached out. So you just have to communicate honestly with whoever and talk. I'm a Midwestern, conservative family. We still don't talk about it. I'm the one loudmouth that's over here making waves, whether they like it or not. But, for 9.5 years, we didn't talk, and that's people's right. But for me, talking is one of the major things that has kept me alive now.
You know, Joel and Gary, Kerri really makes a very important point that we don't have services that can reach out to the family. This is something that maybe public defenders' offices should consider. There's no reason that they can't have those services. The other point I want to make is your PTSD is rather different than, obviously, than from somebody has actually experienced some kind of event, but it's very similar. And when I read about you, it was a very sensory experience, because I read that you had made a chocolate cake, and when the officer had turned up, and you still can get flashbacks to smelling chocolate. I mean, I think that's such a perfect example of where people have to really start learning about how the PTSD affects the moment that you heard about your father is when it sprang into action, so to speak. It's different than somebody that is actually physically experiencing a traumatic victimization or something, but it still has, I think you're one of the best persons to be able to kind of point out the steps that trauma work should follow, and it should start early. I never had thought of that, but I don't see why public defenders, if that's the office that many, couldn't offer something.
Yeah,
Well,
even sorry.
No, no, please. Please.
Not just the chocolate cake, but it's chocolate cake in the form of a butt pan. So I am working on a second book that's heavily focused on trauma. And I have a whole section about trying to go make a cake chocolate on the like anniversary, the 8th or 9th anniversary. I don't know the math. It's one of the anniversaries of his arrest, and we're snowed in, and I got kids running amok. And I'm flashing back, you know, it's 2013, and I'm flashing back thinking I'm in 2005. And I've had to do that trauma work of learning to anchor and center myself. I literally have it on my phone, because Friday, as soon as when they announced the arrest in Delphi, it really got to me. I was thankful they finally found somebody after 5 years. But knowing that Alan's family, what they were going through, and then being immersed in this Idaho case, and then the arrest. I mean, I was physically ill this Friday, but I was saying back when I was trying to do this anniversary, you know, I got it in my head to make chocolate cake, and I touched the butt pan, and I thought I was back in 2005, and my daughter's like trying to make cake with me. She's like 6 or something. You know, that's my reality now. I still literally have to center myself, and because I'm always on alert, or I can be, always waiting for something bad to happen. School shootings absolutely set me off. I have to basically quiet my phone, any audio, video. I got the gunfire of the Las Vegas shooting stuck in my head. I literally had to go back to therapy just because I got the gunfire sound stuck in my head. I mean, that's my reality even now, of having to remind myself, it is 2023, you are in Florida, you see palm trees, you have kids. It is not 2005. I mean, I literally do that today if I have to. Now, I don't have to every day, thank goodness, but it was my reality just this Friday.
It's extraordinary to hear you describe this so vividly. And I know how difficult it probably is to talk about it right now, and that you must feel it serves a purpose to help other people. Otherwise, why put yourself through discussing it like this? It was very brave and powerful. You know, one of the things that comes up a lot when Ann and I are studying the histories of people who commit violent crime is the disproportionate amount of trauma that they've experienced. And one of the very unusual things about the case of your father is that he often winds up on a list of people who've committed serial offenses where people can't really identify difficult, adverse experiences in his life. I saw once a letter that your father had written to I think, an author, where he told the person that he thought that the explanation was a head injury that he had had at some point in his life. And I always questioned this as being a true story. And I wondered, do you have any idea whatsoever of anything that might have been negative in your father's life growing up, or did he have a pretty normal childhood?
Well, before we discuss my dear father, we need to agree that he's a sexual sadistic psychopath and a pathological narcissistic liar. So anything my father says, you have to take with lots of salt, meaning
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Ramsland's complete book on my father has to be taken in the light that maybe it's worth reading because it gives you insane insight into somebody's mind like my father, but he contradicts and repeats himself, and Lord knows what avenues he runs, fantastical avenues he runs down. So he's not really that all helpful, like say Mr. Kemper. So anyway, with my father, he was born in 1945, and his grandpa William was still overseas in World War II. He had served in Midway after the big battle. He worked on airplanes. So as far as I understand, grandpa and grandma had gotten married in 43 before grandpa went overseas. And grandma was only around 16. She took a train out to California. They got married. Grandpa went overseas. At some point, there would have had to have been shore leave for my father to have been conceived. So when he was born to like an 18-year-old with my grandpa gone in Columbus, Kansas. Now, he was raised then by my grandma with my grandma's family's help. My grandma was young. Grandpa didn't even come back from what I understand for another year. Now, my dad did have a dent on his head. He claims his grandma Dorothea dropped him on his head when he was a baby, and I don't think he ever forgave her for that. I also have a dent on my head because I've ran into a multitude of things because I'm klutzy. Do I even have a parking ticket? No. So can we blame a bump on his head? No. Um, can we blame genetics? Everybody always throws genetics at me. Somebody on Twitter did today, and I was like, please don't do that because I have half of the man's genes. Um, and I have children. So, you know, I don't like that avenue. But we don't really know, I don't think. I think that's one of the big puzzles, you know. So with my father, he was left. I think he has some abandonment issues, and he definitely has issues with my grandma Dorothea. Post arrest, we learned of those, especially in Ramsland's book, but I didn't really see it. Um, Pre-arrest, he was the good oldest son that always did the right thing. So my dad has three younger brothers. They're good guys. There's no issues there that I'm aware of. Two of them served in Vietnam. You know, one of them has some things from that, but they're not out there committing crimes like my father. Um, but my father was left some alone with his grandparents, he claims, while my grandma was off working in Wichita when he was little. So there could be some abandonment. My father's wrote some poetry, especially early on, that sort of hints, you can Google it, it hints at like possibly sexual abuse. He's at one point he was blaming seeing chickens' heads being cut off by his country grandparents as where his issues came from. My question is, was my father maybe sexually abused in the barn while he saw the chickens? Something like that could have traumatically altered the course of my father. The only person that has the answers is my father, and he's not reliable. And there's no way he would ever cop to have been being abused if he even remembers. So my father then claims he had a conduct disorder, what we would now call oppositional defiance disorder, and then conduct disorder. By the time he was like 7 or 8, he says he was window peeping, stealing underwear, breaking and entering into his elementary school. By the time he was 12, he says he was exposed to pulp magazines, detective magazines that had real crime scenes, that he had this fascination with bondage early on. We don't necessarily have proof of all this, but I don't know. My grandparents were amazing people. I love them very much. I spent a lot of time with them. I mean, I literally played hide and seek with my cousins in the basement, where come to find out my father dressed up in victims' clothing and took photos of bondage of himself. I mean, all that stuff really messes you up. So when we're talking about, maybe it's not PTSD, but it's trauma. I mean, literally everything my father could have done, has done, crime scene photos I've seen, details of crimes, my father's words, his voice, I can't handle his voice. All of that is traumatic to me. So it's not just like this one time thing happened. It's just like bam, 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 18 years of bullshit, honestly, because of my father.
Right. Well, one of the things that Ann and I put together when we were thinking about questions is when you look back at some of even the pro-social things that your dad did, do they feel to you in retrospect like they reflected a need for control and kind of manipulating other people, even the things that superficially looked kind or like pro-social activities? Did you notice that across his life, or was that confined to the offenses?
Oh no, he was such a freaking control freak. Like we used to joke with him that he had OCD. I mean, that's probably not a very nice thing to joke with somebody, but the man wanted like types of cereal, and then he wanted to mix them in his own little cereal mix. Um, as I detailed in my book, he had to sit in a certain chair where he had his back to the wall so he could face the door, because he never liked to sit with his back to the door. Did he expect the FBI coming in at any minute? Who knows with my father? But that was his chair, and you could not sit in that chair if he was home. So if he came home for lunch and you were sitting there, then you had to move. As a little girl, by the time I was 4 or 5, I knew to keep my shoes picked up and mind my behavior around my father, because it wouldn't be pleasant. You could get spanked, or, he would be gruff and yelly, Um, People have talked about him being really persnickety at work, and really just everything had to be just right, you know. You could get my father to relax. So I learned very early, really from watching my mother, how to control my father. That was to send him outside. He turned into a different man when you sent him outside, because he could breathe. He did not like inside. I mean, honestly, if somebody had just let him live in the country, and do his own thing, hopefully not murder, maybe he would have kept some of this under control. He always said he wished he had lived in like the 1800s and been a cowboy. Um, like he didn't like to be contained. So as a little girl, I knew if I wanted like decent time with my father, I knew to garden with him, and we would walk the dog, fishing, camping. He was so much fun because he let you get away with anything, like he would let you be head to toe dirty. He always treated me like a boy. My mom treated me like a girl, made me wear dresses. Dad didn't care. So dad was like my best friend, like he would come up to college, he'd take me to go fishing. And he was like the best dad ever. Like he drove me back and forth to college a billion times, moved all my stuff, moved me to Michigan after I got married. I mean, okay, so he's a psychopath, but was he a psychopath? I mean, you can't turn that off and on, but it's not, he was just my dad, you know? So, like, it's really hard for me to like separate that out.
I'm gonna hop in real
Right.
quick and then
I'll
give
turn
it.
I'll turn it over to Ann now. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
gonna real quick comment and then right back to Anne. This one comes from D 1955 to the beautiful, brave, intelligent, insightful, and empathetic Kerri Rawson. It's unimaginable the pain you have suffered. Would you be willing to share how this affected other members of your family? I have no doubt you have helped so many others, especially through your eyes as a young girl who loved her father.
Oh, okay. So my mom she has dealt with this like that my father died on the day of his arrest. So she was going home every day for like 13 years having lunch with him in Park City, a suburb of Wichita. So she was on her way home to lunch and she saw a helicopter overhead and was like, I wonder who they're picking up now. Well, it was my father. So she goes home, makes lunch. My father never shows up. And then the FBI and police and SWAT, I believe, they all come in. So she said for her to manage things and live, she had to determine, she just dealt with it like he died. Like early on, it was sort of like, well, it was a massive grieving process for all of us because for us, Kohlberger's family, Richard Allen's family, it is like a grieving process that you've lost a father, you've lost a brother, you've lost a son. So there's that element that now you're grieving somebody that's still alive, and everybody hates that has completely become infamous, bad guy, being called evil, monster, despicable piece of earth, and it's your dad. So for her, I don't know. We were at my uncle's. We found out my father was confessing. You know, she had a yellow notepad. She was trying to figure out what is he confessing to. She wanted to understand. You know, she wrote him up until when he pled. Then she cut him off, took an emergency divorce, and has never spoke to him since. So he still writes her, and she reads the letters. So it's sort of like she's reading letters from a dead person. I don't know. That's how she handles it. So we don't talk about it too much. But when my book came out, I was home and I gave her one. And she called me and she said, I couldn't put it down. She's like, I knew everything that was going to happen, but she said, I couldn't put it down. I just wanted to know what happened next. And then she said, I feel horrible. I didn't know how much you were mentally suffering in college before your father's arrest with your own mental health issues. And why didn't you tell me? So my mom has just tried to maintain a normal life, you know, stayed in her community, active with her family. She's just about as normal person as you can ever imagine, you know, and she didn't want to ever be a victim, and she didn't want to let my father win. So they were married over 30 years, and she said, that's it. I'm done with your father. And she never remarried. She said she would never, ever want to touch another man again. And I don't blame her. The interesting thing about PTSD is that my mom and I both have PTSD from finding out. We were 16 hours away. It was handled differently. And we both have PTSD. And we both have issues. You were talking about control. Growing up, my father was neurotic. Neurotic about deadbolts. We had to be deadbolted into the house. This is the key. You're little. This is the key. If there's a fire, this is how you get out. You know, and he worked for ADT, so he had the ADT system stickers on the windows, but we had no ADT wired. He even put like electrical tape around to make it look like our door was fired. He was so safety conscious and sane, it was insane. Like so overly protective, especially of my mom and me being female. You know, and he said later, after he committed the murders in the 70s during that time, he was worried the police were going to come for him. And it was almost like he was protecting my mom from him. And my mom even said, like, I'm concerned about these murders going on. And he says, no, you're safe. But he even talks about getting more guns. Like he's almost trying to protect himself from them, but trying to protect my family, you know? So I grew up being neurotic, like checking locks. I hate screen doors. His last murder, he threw a cement block through Mrs. Davis's screen door. I knew about that when I was 12. I mean, I knew it had happened. You know, there's a phone conversation in 2001 when I'm in college. Dad, should I live in an apartment with a screen door? We had a whole conversation about that. 4 years later, I found out what he had done with a screen door. I'm literally living with a screen door right now, which is like a massive, major accomplishment that I can live with the screen door. But yeah, he just embedded this very weird safety and security into us when he was it was like he was trying to protect us from him, but he was the bad guy. I don't know. It's so messed up. I don't understand it.
Joel, did you have another, or Gary have another question? I,
Well,
I,
I was just
yeah.
going to make a quick comment that, very quick comment that when we look at the way that some people who commit serious sexual homicide pick victims, that sometimes the offenders who are more on the obsessional side, like you're describing, Kerri, almost seem partially motivated to punish people who have certain vulnerabilities, who are less obsessional. So that the idea is that you pick a victim who has a door that's easy to get through, or hasn't locked the windows, or doesn't have an alarm system, or something like that, because it's a way of saying, I have more control than you do. I'm invulnerable, and you made yourself vulnerable, therefore you must pay. And it's a way, I think, of blaming the victims for their own terrible fates. But I think, not to bring up traumatic memories, but
You're
every
good.
account I've ever read of your father spoke about that process of prowling and kind of picking people based on vulnerabilities that he had examined over time. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about that he had a personality that was kind of like you're describing, where you can put the two pieces together and really start to understand what he might have been kind of projecting into people that he wanted to feel more powerful than. And so it's very valuable to the way that you painted that. But I'll sort of hand you off to Anne, because I think Anne has a question for you now.
Yeah, I had one question before I wanted to turn to something else, but how about your brother's reaction, Kerri?
Um,
Did you described your mom's, but how about your brother? He's younger, right, than you?
no, he's 3 years older.
He's
And
older.
so he had a little bit of a different relationship with my father because he was in Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. My father was a leader for several years. So he had that relationship with my father apart from me. I always wanted to be a scout. I was very upset that I didn't get to be a Boy Scout. My brother was in the Navy in Connecticut, notified, the FBI notified him. Now, my brother told them that day that he had ran into a bondage type drawing of my father's when he was young. As far as we know, he never told my mother, and we don't know if that traumatically impacted my brother. I imagine it possibly did. You were not allowed to get into your father's stuff. It would not go well for you. People always question how in our small home we didn't know. I mean, you just left my father's stuff alone, and you did. I did my father's laundry for Pete's sakes, and but you just left his stuff alone.
Yeah.
So my brother did better when he was in the Navy. Like that sort of environment really was helpful and protective for my brother. Then he went on for a college degree, and now he has a job. But I would say my father has profoundly affected my brother, but I would say in different ways necessarily than me. And that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it for my
Sure.
brother.
Yeah.
And the rest of my family, um, it's hard. It's been real hard. We've sort of imploded in some ways, unfortunately. Part of it too is, my grandparents are all gone, the people that kind of kept everybody together, but
Yeah.
I just don't have those relationships I used to have. But is that a normal, natural growing older, or is that because of my father? I don't know. And going back to you were saying, Gary, about controlling victims and blaming them. When my father entered the Otero home, he was actually after Julie Otero, the mother. She was in her 30s, and her oldest daughter, Carmen, who was a high schooler or a middle schooler. Now, when he stepped into the home, their car was there, but he thought Joseph Otero had gone to work or something. Or no, their car wasn't there because it was being worked on. So he now walks into a home with a father, Joseph Otero, and 2 young children at home, Josephine and Joey, 11 and 9. Now, my father does not have a ski mask on, but he could at that point have made the choice. And even when we're talking about psychopaths and we're talking potentially about Koberger and all the rest of these guys, I'm not saying insanity, and really they do insane things, but I really do not want to call any of them insane, as in they are in control of their choices and behavior. And they know what they are, they don't care, and they do it anyway. So my father had full control, knew what he was capable of, steps into that home. He could have stepped right back out. Instead, he come up with this ruse that he was like trying to get to California, and he just wanted to tie him up and steal their money. You know, he's just a normal, everyday guy breaking into a home. And if you look at Ramsland's book, in my father's own words, he blames the Otero family. He says, well, they saw my face, so I have to put them down as then they're animals, like he is the compliance officer. So right then he's blaming them for what he's about to do, which he knows he's going to do as he enters that home. And the rest of his victims were women, because he said it was easier, and he still got the same sexual release, which is one of the major things that drives my father. So why bother, quotes, with men? The interesting thing is he never touched children after my brother was born. So
that's very interesting.
Yeah, because Catherine Bright was a young woman in 74, 2 months after Otero's. Then he thought he was going to get caught because that crime scene was a mess and it was not under control. It was not planned. My dad did not like that one. He was sure he was going to get caught, and then he waited until 77. Yeah, so he stopped. That's another thing my father could stop.
Right. Well, there's a question that has sort of bothered me for a long time in the case of your father, and perhaps you can finally answer this for me. In the lives of people who commit serious sexual homicide, Ann and I have seen many cases of this. There's sometimes a life event that precedes the first time, some chaotic event, the loss of a loved one, something like that. And it's interesting, by the way, that the suspect in the Idaho case, I think, would have turned 28 very shortly after the offenses. And I believe your father was 28 at the time of the Otero murders. I thought that was very interesting. Mm-hmm. Is there an event that precipitated the first killing that you're aware? In other words, the point at which years of fantasy finally spilled over. Can you think of something?
I didn't know that until Ramsland's book. So my father detailed that he lost his job in 73. He was working with Coleman, and then he had to go work at Cessna. And my father lost it. He was laid off with ADT in 88, and then was in the census and then laid off. It was absolutely devastating as a child to watch my father be laid off. My father was a very proud man, but just in a normal, general American dad sort of way, like not, people will say he was egotistical and whatever. I never really saw that. In hindsight, maybe, but it was very devastating to watch my father lose his job, not be able to make the income, deal with some poverty, probably my parents trying to manage things. So my father says in 73, he got laid off, and he had only been married about a year and a half or a couple years, and he felt very depressed. My father did have anxiety, or he does have anxiety. He has depression. I do too, but he never bothered to mention that. Thanks, Dad. His mother, grandma, has anxiety, depression. So that runs through my father's line. So my father said he just got very depressed and he got bored. Now, my father is somebody that can stay out of trouble if you can keep him busy. So he would actually redirect himself into gardening, stamps, fishing, the racetrack. He's somebody that if he could occupy and get obsessed with something else, it would lessen the need to murder. So He said he got unoccupied in 73 and depressed, thinking about bad things, fantasizing. And there was actually, according to my father, an attempted kidnapping in the fall of 73, which I didn't know until I read about it. So he supposedly tried to kidnap a woman out of a bank in front of the stairs at Twin Lakes in Wichita. She escaped, and then he fixated on the Oteros. So my father will tell you that he trolled for victims. That's the word my father likes to use, trolling, and stalked. My father would tell you he actually really enjoyed the stalking and the trolling the most. He was always doing that, always. Like, he said most of the time that was enough to keep that sexual urge under control. Between that, fantasizing, drawing, dressing up, what he called motel parties. There was when he was in the census, he would take victims' clothing and wigs, masks, go bondage himself. I mean, sometimes he almost bondaged himself so much he couldn't get out of the bondage. I mean, he even claims he did this on Boy Scout trips. There's photos. He would take a Polaroid, so there's photos. I literally know the man's tube socks. So that's a fun thing to know. Your father's tube socks and his bondage. That doesn't go away. So yes, so there was this lack of work, not having anything to do, that led eventually to Oteros very quickly within a few months. They were just an option. He always just had options. And it's gut-wrenching as a person to think of possibly in the Idaho case, they were just an option. Now we don't know. Like, was he specifically fixated? Did he have some sort of connection with the victims? We don't know. But honestly, in my father's case, other than possibly my neighbor, even though they were just options. And honestly, when he was in trial, he couldn't even necessarily remember their names or their addresses or the dates of his murders, because it's not really about them. It's about him and his release. Everything's about him. And in 91, the last murder, Mrs. Davis, when I was 12, my mom had been in the hospital with asthma and pneumonia for like 12 days. Dad was laid off from the census. The worst probably period of my childhood. My dad's trying to cook. My dad is not a cook. He's trying to manage things. He's super stressed out. He ran our car into a neighbor's car. He's like just on edge, dark and seething. He would just flip. He could just flip on a dime and just become like beady and mean and gruff, and you like had to lock your door, like just in a dime. So it's really hard now to know. When I was 12, my mom was in the hospital. She gets out. My dad is depressed, bored, seething. He fixates on Mrs. Davis and murders her because he's unemployed, sort of. And my lovely father put Mrs. Davis's body in our family Oldsmobile, drove her to a pond, left her there, or drove her in her car. And then at some point he went back to Scouts or Trappers Rendezvous. It was the winter one. Makes up stories about why he's gone. And at some point transports her body then in our family Oldsmobile, takes her somewhere else, puts a mask on her, maybe goes back again. And then I get that car handed down to me. So now I'm driving a car in high school that later on I found out had a dead body in it. Thank you, Dad. That's my reality. And my reality is that I'm not finding this all out in 2005. It comes in little tiny pieces. So there's new information that came to me a lot in Dr. Ramson's book. Took me weeks in therapy to do that one. Before that, it was therapy with the Wichita Eagle BTK book, which I highly recommend for the case. And then I'll be on a podcast and somebody will mention some graphic detail from a crime and it'll be new to me, and then I got to go assimilate it. So that's my ongoing traumatic reality.
Yeah, I just want to pass it back to Anne. There's been the fact that he studied with Dr. Ramsland, you mentioned that, and people are now giving him the moniker BCK, obviously very similar to your father's. Dr. Burgess, I know that's something you wanted to discuss.
Right. Had you heard that, Kerri? Had you heard the BCK, actually his initials, and that what are the similarities between your father and the suspect in the Idaho case?
So on Friday when he was arrested, people were pointing out the BCK. I mean, I caught on the BK thing. You know, social media, most people are breathing a BK just for simplicity's sake, but some people are trying to make a thing out of it. Now, can Brian Christopher Koberger be accused of having those initials? No, he was born in 1994. That's
Sure.
just one of those things. Now, at some point, we assume he became fixated on crime. There seemed to be some report that maybe even back in high school, I don't know if earlier, we'll probably find out. Did he latch partly on? Did he, at some point, has he latched on to my father just because of the initials? Like, did he find that attraction, or did he find it empowering? Like, did it add to his own mythology? It gets complicated with Ramsland, so I have been doing some media. Part of the reason I became ill on Friday was as soon as I found out about the Ramsland connection, because it's just too close. It's close to home, because I've had a personal relationship off and on with Ramsland, off record. She kind of helped me kind of dive into some stuff with my father. And of course, then there was her book. And she's been a very close colleague and friend of my father's for many years. Now, I don't know if it's ongoing, but massive letter writing, phone calls. They play chess. They would play chess through letter writing, one move at a time. She's visited. I think he would probably consider her one of his best friends. I'm sure he probably has a whole thing about her and fixated on her. It's complicated because could Koberger have had contact with my father? We don't know. We need evidence. So that's what I've been trying to say. We need evidence of letters. With their cases, then they both committed forward. Was this Koberger's first murder? My instinct says yes, but we're just going to have to see what they find.
Sure.
I'm sure they're looking. The age is the same. My father was 28. Koberger just turned 28. I also think that maybe Koberger really was fixated possibly on Kaylee, or Maddie, but I my gut sort of says Kaylee. I sort of wonder if Koberger inadvertently entered the house only going for one of the girls on the third floor and ran into Ethan on the second floor and then had to take out Santa and the other girl. But again, are we going back to something like my father would say, well, I had to kill them? It makes me wonder because of leaving two survivors, but maybe he was injured at some point. Maybe the knife broke. Maybe he was exhausted. It's not easy to stab four people, from what I understand.
Do you
Go
have
ahead.
any knowledge if he had studied your father as a student?
Well, he absolutely would have studied him in a general academic field. I mean, Catherine Ramsland has a class called Deviant Minds. I believe it's possibly for undergrads and grads, and there have been some other students talking about him being in that class, specifically on serial killers. Now, do I know her curriculum well enough to say how focused it is on my father? But I would have to assume, based on her specific special relationship with my father, he had to have been one of her big highlights and possibly one of the draws to be in a program.
Sure.
Except their MOs are so different. My father primarily strangulated. My father's all about control. He hated mess. He hated blood. He did stab Catherine Bright to death 2 months after the Oteros, but that's only because it got out of control and he had wrestled with her brother and he was afraid he was going to get caught. So he just had to do it quickly, in my father's words, but he didn't like it. So my father couldn't even handle me and my mom getting hurt and bleeding. It made him all mad and angry, and then he would blame you for getting hurt. Like, I would just be klutzy, and it was somehow my fault that I had, like, disrupted his day because my knee is bleeding. And then he was, like, upset that I was scarring. Well, I'm a tomboy, so he
Yeah.
like, he just wanted me to be perfect. So, no, he would not have liked going in with a knife and doing what Kohlberger did.
Yeah.
That's different.
How about the DNA, the way they caught your father?
Oh, well, I think I'm probably one of the first genetic familiar investigative DNA cases. I might be the first, I'm not sure. Um, so in 2005, my father had been playing communication games with the police for like 11 months. Now, honestly, if my father had not come back and played these games, I don't know if they would have ever caught him, or at least had caught him then. Nowadays, genetics would have definitely caught up with my father.
Sure.
So he had sent a disc in, one of those old hard discs. He had used it before and he thought he had wiped it. Well, he even had talked to some people at the Park City Police at least about, can discs be traced? And somebody had told him no. Well, he used the same disc he had used at the church and the library, and he was the president of the church. Anyway, so they thought they had him, but they didn't want to arrest the wrong guy. So they worked out a plan. The KBI, I believe, was mainly behind it. They figured out he had a daughter. So they went up to Kansas State where I had been a student, and they dug through my medical records. And they grabbed pap smears, but I believe what they actually grabbed was a slide. They got a warrant and a subpoena and all that. Didn't ask me or anything. I would have given it to them, but of course they weren't going to ask.
Yeah.
I believe what they got was a sample of a cervical cyst that had been removed. So I like to argue about the pap smear, but they took it to the crime lab in Topeka and extracted the DNA, and it was a very difficult process to have this old slide and the technology then. And it was like almost an exact match, a match for me to my father. So it came back on a Thursday night, and then they got everybody together and arrested him on Friday. So I don't know anything about all this DNA and anything. And then CNN was leading with, like, I had turned my father in and I had given a blood sample. I mean, that's still out there. Like, it's been almost 18 years and that stuff is still out there.
Just want to bounce back in with a quick comment from Citizen Cage. Question: does Kerri have any contact whatsoever with her father, and did she ever ask him point blank why he did what he did?
I'll take the first one first. So you'll see in my book in the early letters in like March of 2005, like basically I'm like, hey, we know you did it, or, if you did this, like, we know you did it, you need to you get the right to a trial, but you really need to take a guilty plea. My father has never once talked about his crimes to me. Again, we were talking earlier about separating dad and BTK. He's been very, very separate. He is not BTK with my family, and he's almost not embarrassed by it, but it just makes him uncomfortable, like, to merge those worlds together. I mean, he's never really apologized. He's kind of gotten close to it. After I started speaking up in 2015, he read my news article. He wrote me and he said, I finally understand, what the big deal is here. And he said I shed some tears, but then in the same letter, he's back to being a narcissistic, controlling psychopath. So you're not going to get a straight word out of my dad from me. He wants to keep those lives very, very separate. Also, he has always had a very hard time understanding why we had an issue after he was arrested, because in his mind, he was always BTK, right? So he's walking around for 31 years knowing he's Denis Rader and knowing he's BTK, and nobody seemed to have an issue with it, right? So this is where things do not go all the way home. I'm not saying insanity, but there's something disconnected in there. Not just morally, but mentally disconnected in his brain. where he doesn't empathetically understand why everything changed and why we are now the way we are, because he always was BTK around us. There's some sort of disconnect, and it does not matter how hard you would be to convince. You could maybe get in there for a few minutes. Occasionally you will get in there and you'll get some sanity, but more and more is just gone. So also then you were asking about contact now. So we stayed in touch via letters. There were gaps where I couldn't handle things and I shut down for several years. I forgave him in 2012. Things got better. We were doing okay, but then he tried to insert himself into my life when I started speaking up in the media. He wanted to be a part of my book. He wanted me to publish his art. He wanted to be in control. He wanted me to be part of Ramson's book. Then he wanted to be in control of my book, be part of it. He used to send me pictures, drawings of gaping aquatic animals. He's called himself the Pisces, the Kansas Pisces. He's taken on a whole new persona in jail. So he doesn't necessarily like to call himself BTK, but he calls himself the Kansas Pisces, and he lives in El Cavera. He has all these drawings and arts and this whole symbology after arrest, this whole myth thing built around the Pisces. So he likes to send me these photos of gaping animal teeth. I do not know why. Then what was happening was that people were contacting me via social media. People I do not know, emailing me, telling me, hey, we're good friends with your dad and he's this great guy, and what is your problem? Why don't you go visit? Why don't you talk to him? Why are you being disrespectful and a disrespectful daughter to your father? We're trying to get a hold of you. And they were sending clips of my social media, clips of my children, basically cyber stalking me for my father. So it reached this point where people were seeing me like on a podcast. Literally, somebody will probably call my father tomorrow and or in a few days, and let them know she was on a podcast. So somebody had let him know where I lived now. And then right after that, I found out that people were getting crime scene photos into my father of Josephine Otero, 11-year-old, he strangled, getting a crime scene photo into my father in the prison, and he was signing them with Denis Rader and BTK. And then they were being sold on the black memorabilia market, which is very heavy with my father. And I said, nope, that's it, I'm done. No more dad. So I contacted KDOC and law enforcement, the detectives. I keep some detectives on speed dial as needed. And the prison, and they sent me a do not contact order, and they served it to him a day before his birthday 2 years ago. So I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when he got that do not contact order. So since then, nobody's bothered me directly, because he's not allowed to talk to people about me or send them to harass me. And honestly, because my father gets so off on stalking, he literally has been stalking me and God knows who else from within the prison, using people that think he's swell. There's women in love with him and everything, and he uses these people to harass his family because he wants the attention. He doesn't want to be forgotten. He's still thriving in his little psychopathic, controlling bubbles and fantasizing. I mean, he can't physically hurt anybody else, but he's still causing damage. And I think I really did not want to have to speak up with Idaho. I was just trying to quietly learn and help where I could. And then when I saw Ramsland, I basically had to get ahead of it the other day because media was blowing up. So he's still causing harm. I understand that we got to study these guys from an academic standpoint. But my question is, should we be letting somebody like my father have access to the public? Yeah. He has human rights, but where does that line cross, and what harm is he still causing? I mean, honest to God, I had to decide in 2005 that if somebody wanted me dead, I would be dead, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to leave my home. So I function every day as if somebody like my father or a coworker or some random person wants me dead, I'm going to be dead. And I had to decide that and then still decide how to live, because otherwise I would not be able to function. And then my father goes and cyber stalks me. The father I knew before 2005 would have never done that. So what did we miss? It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. I have no answers.
Kerri, I want to defer to you because we talked about this the other night. Just hearing this story is unbelievable to me. And I'm the son of a psychiatrist. I've not heard anything to this degree, but I've heard a lot. The fact that her father, Denis Rader, is still stalking Kerri, that he's signing these horrific photographs in prison, it shocks all of us. Does it surprise you? Or is this what you expect from your line of work, Kerri?
Well, I think Anne would echo what I'm about to say, but Anne, jump in if you don't. But I think it's actually entirely consistent with people of this personality type that when you reflect on their lives, really from beginning to end, you see a need to varying degrees to be in complete and total control of everything. And that degree of control might get to the level of asserting control and domination over victims through sexual assault or murder. But it can also be things like, needing to assert profound control even over the minutia of daily life, and having all kinds of jobs and interactions with people in which, if you really think about it, the person is always pulling the strings. And I think stalking is a pretty classic behavior in someone who has that kind of blend of kind of depressive emptiness, psychopathy, narcissism, where you sort of make somebody or something the compensation for all of the deadness that you internally experience, and they are your entire life and must be manipulated like marionettes at all times. And it's a very vampiric process. Kerri, you refer throughout this entire interview to what is really an experience of feeling almost as if your own life force is drained to inflate the needs and ego of your father. And so you really get the image of a very parasitic kind of a person. And what I have found so touching, so powerful as you're talking, is the idea of having to completely reinvent the way you saw your father, to view him not as this loving person that you celebrated holidays with and went on trips with and whose hand you might have held, or etc., to someone who is literally leeching your life energy from you at all times and hovering in this very disturbing way. And it's interesting that there's almost a contagiousness to the compartmentalization your father must have been using to keep his life kind of split apart, where he had this darker part and this other part, and then the people around you have to do it too, because it would be too catastrophic to bridge it. And one of the other things that I found very interesting in people who engage in that kind of splitting mechanism, like your dad was using, that kind of black and white view of the self that you keep apart, is that sometimes they have a longing for the bridge to be split, the split to be bridged, because they want the world to see them the way they see themselves, like kind of giant, fascinating figure. And so they flirt with it by right under your nose putting photographs or mementos or things that you could find at any time, sometimes hidden right in the floorboards or the staircase or the right in boxes around the house, because there's a fantasy that someone will open up the box or something and say, wow, that's who they really are, this figure of control and power and domination and all that. And so it's very moving to hear you describe the other side of being around somebody like that. But Anne, would you echo the idea that need for control and so forth would probably continue across the whole lifetime, that it wouldn't be something that would stop?
Oh, absolutely. It hasn't. Look what he's done. Look at Kerri's the only one that was able to stop him. and got that order or protection order, whatever, and had the courage. It really shows how her trauma work has been successful. He really has advanced. He can't do what he would want to do, what he was doing, so he finds another way, and that's the cyber stalking. I think that's very interesting of how he has transitioned into another level, and that he's doing signing autographs, if you will, of these scenes is incredibly important. I think Kerri has given us some very, very interesting things to discuss, and her insight, Kerri, it's a real tribute to the insight and the work that you've done in treatment. Really is, as Gary said, very powerful.
Yeah, it's
Very
not.
powerful.
Oh, and it's not just crime scene photos and artwork. I do think artwork is a very healthy way for criminals that are incarcerated to express themselves. I have no problem with giving them art supplies. I think it is a healthy release. I have a problem when it crosses over, not my father's not done this, but crossing over into, say, taking pubic hair and putting it on something and sending it, that, and then the black market, I have massive issues with that. It's been an ongoing thing I've been speaking about for years when I became aware of it. So my father skirts around the Son of Sam laws he is not allowed to profit from his crimes, but he skirts around it because he gives people drawings and letters, and they give him money, and then they go sell these things on the collectible black market. And then my poor self shows up on Instagram instantly scrolling through cat photos, and oh yeah, there's dad's artwork, or there's somebody's pubes on a piece of paper. Recently, right before the Delphi arrest, I was having issues with a man that I actually contacted law enforcement as a possible Delphi suspect. Now, no, that was not the case, but occasionally somebody will just flag my guts, and somebody will get an email and maybe humor me a little or something, or, will treat me well. But this man was collecting the mask that copies of the mask my father had put on Dolores Davis's body in '91. They became a big hit because of the Mindhunter TV show, which I could not handle watching. I watched one episode of the first season and could not handle any more of it. So I am not an authority on the show. Anyway, the masks were being copied and mass produced on Etsy down to a pink string that had been dirtied, like the one that was in my father's trial. And this man on Instagram collects these, replica masks and has them hanging in his man cave with various artwork of various killers and letters and whatnot. And I pretty much just sort of lost it that day and had to contact the detective because I didn't even know if that was the real mask till I got a hold of myself and hunted it down to Etsy. I don't know what that fascination is with the collection of this material. I don't know, other than people like to get up close to the monsters and not actually be hurt by the monsters. But it makes my Instagram scrolling.
Does he have access to social media or not? No.
So no, he has no access to the internet. He's in solitary. He has access to letter writing, which he has prolifically done. Like Ramsden even has a word for hieroglyphia or something where my father might be like obsessively needing to write. And telephones. That is what he has access to.
And that was how
he's in. I'm sorry, Ann. He's in solitary, basically 23 hours a day.
Yeah, he has access to outside, but I don't know how much he goes. And they got so tired of dealing with him because he's such a narcissist, and because he's such a high-profile criminal, they were never allowed to put him in general. They built him his own shower. And then he's a pack rat, so he keeps all of his letters and all of his materials because he likes to study. So he studies himself, even though he's not technically allowed access to his own crimes. He's not allowed my book. but people have sent it to him in pieces. He gets upset because then they have to go in and clean out his cell. He was always asking, "Can I ship you boxes of my stuff?" And I was like, "No, don't." I mean, as criminologist, you're probably like, "Oh my goodness," but I was like, "I don't want your stuff, Dad." So he used to send me clippings of news articles he read. He wanted me to like study criminals with him to help me figure out what's wrong with him. He wanted me to read certain books that he had like underlined. I mean, he talks about in Ramsland's book, he's trying to understand what's wrong with him still. And then now in the black market, he sent out sweatpants that he tied into one of his knots with his name stamped on them. He sent out fillings that they had removed. So yeah, he's getting all sorts of stuff out. Now that maybe was locked down after I spoke to them again a few years ago. I don't know. But yeah, stuff was definitely getting out that should not have been getting out, and stuff was getting in that definitely should not have been getting in, and I don't know exactly how.
I'm going to pose one last question. This one comes from Marina, and it's for Ann and Gary. And then I could sit here all day. I'm a fan today. I'm not a host, so you guys can decide when you want to wrap it. But final viewer question from Marina to Ann and Gary. Have you ever thought about how different your point of view might be if you got to study killers who are not caught, like the actual very highly intelligent ones? Gary, you want to take that? And then Gary and Ann, feel free, as long as Kerri's okay with it, to continue, and we'll wrap it up in a little bit.
Well, it's a complicated question because, first of all, it presupposes that not being caught has something to do with intellect. I'm not necessarily sure that's true. I think sometimes there is a kind of mythologizing of people that are serial offenders for some very strange reason, where we imagine them to be highly intelligent. As a matter of fact, what I have found in my own study and using some data that was kindly given to me by the people who run the serial killer database at Radford and Gulf Coast universities, and I've made this point before on other programs, is that highly intelligent killers where we have their IQs seem to have very specific kind of patterns. Like, for example, it's much more likely for highly intelligent killer to be very curious about bodies and the sort of to intellectualize what happens when I do such and such to a person, so that you're much more likely to see things like torture and mutilation in people who have these sort of higher intellects, which is very strange, but it has something to do with intellectual curiosity and intellectual detachment from victims. Another interesting thing about people like that is they're much more likely to be collectors. And I found, for example, that serial killers who engaged in torture were much more likely to collect things, like Wayne Gacy collected artwork and articles about himself when he was in jail. In addition to creating artwork, David Parker Ray collected junk that he turned into torture implements. Gary Heidnik collected coins and paper currency. So there is that kind of curiosity and the control of bringing things together that you see, just as an interesting side note about collecting types. But I would say, to get back to the question, it's complicated because we don't know what we don't know. We only know the people that are incarcerated. And among the people that are incarcerated, I think it's important not to fantasize that these are people who have these mammoth intellects. I think that they are people who make foolish mistakes and so forth and get caught, but they are trying to manipulate the storyline that they are larger than life and kind of powerful and so forth. And what you really have to do is pull the curtain away, kind of like in The Wizard of Oz, and realize that behind it is a very sad soul, a very pathetic individual, a person who essentially feels like a nobody, who is toying with the narrative to flip it that you're the nobody and you're dispensable and I'm not sure really about this question, and I'd love your thoughts on it. But I think it's not possible to answer it because we don't know the people that we haven't captured, that haven't been incarcerated. What do you think, Ann?
Well, Kerri is an example of someone that knew someone before he was her dad before he was incarcerated. So I think this has been a fascinating discussion to hear her describe how she grew up with him. And so maybe what we need to do in as a clinical or a research way is to talk with people, more family members who have been through like what Kerri has been through, to see how they describe their father or their brother or their husband or whoever the person is. So you would have that before and after, because as I said, Kerri has been so articulate in describing that. Otherwise, I agree with you. How could you couldn't do it? But now clinicians would have that experience if they had been treating someone who then commits a crime, obviously. So that would be one other place to try to, and obviously academics, I think Ramtland is one who evidently knew someone fairly well as a student before finding out if indeed he turns out to be the suspect. So that's how I would answer the question.
Yeah, I
Right.
think.
And and please, Kerri.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think what happens is as soon as somebody's arrested and called a suspect, it's like a shadow goes over them, and all of a sudden, people are saying they see evil in their eyes or that they feel evil from them. If you would have talked to anybody that knew my father or my family before the arrest, you would get a different sort of report. We were all alibying him and talking about what an upstanding citizen he was. Now, was some of that an act on his part? I don't know. He was very good at putting a mask on and uniforms and mimicking and changing how he was with certain types of people, wanting you to see what he could see. All of that I can see in hindsight. But I would say there's a difference between anybody that knew my family before. Of course, then the reports came out about my father being controlling as a compliance officer and his behavior after the arrest. I mean, I kind of have an issue with social media, like talking about how Kohlberger looks. Now, is there sort of an incel look to sort of some of these mass shooters? I think there is maybe something there. I don't know really how to define it or research it. But I would be interesting to just do a study of putting people's faces and saying, pick out the criminal. If they're not high profile, could somebody do that from just faces without actually knowing what that person's been accused of? I think everything on this side of the line of arrest gets a little bit tainted. And you were talking about being wanted to be known. I think the worst thing you could do for somebody like my father is completely remove him from your life. I mean, to deal with a narcissist, you have to cut them out of your life. I finally had to get to that point because he finally had crossed too many lines with me. I had tried very hard. I was one of the last people to really honestly try and love him, probably because I'm probably the person that loves him the most, more than my mother. There's a special bond there between the two of us. Say whatever you want to about that. So it took a lot to have to cut him off, but it's the only thing you can do. It's the worst thing you can do to one of these people. And I get scolded all the time. I'm getting scolded right now. I'm getting emails saying, you're as bad as your father for speaking up. You just can't be quiet. Like you're giving him a bigger head and he's getting off over there in his jail cell. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I cannot not speak anymore. Yeah. So I'm sorry if that's bothering you in your day.
Well, how do you think?
Sorry. Please, Ann, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm just going to quick follow up with the Kohlberger family. It seems to be doing initially what you all did, providing support, love. We love them. We can't believe this happened. Maybe providing an alibi if need be. Who knows, that drive with the father back to, from Washington State back to Pennsylvania, whatever went on in that car. But at any rate, so it looks like there are certain stages that are pretty usual to go through when a family gets the horrifying news of what's happened. I'm sorry, Kerri, you wanted to say something.
No. I could listen to you all day. But, just on that point about making judgments based upon physiology, the famous forensic figure Cesare Lombroso, used to think, he was as a lot of people did in the 19th century, that people who were criminals would have abnormal facial features because there was a kind of a budding understanding that there probably was something wrong with the brain or the way that somebody was delivered, or something that might have changed the shape of their head or their eyes or so forth. And much of this is sort of pseudoscientific. But what I think is interesting is that when you think about people who are on the wide spectrum that kind of runs from narcissism through psychopathy all the way to sadism, what happens is you have to sort of think of two subtypes. There are people that are much more purely kind of narcissistic or psychopathic, and where they sadistic also, where they can be very charming and attractive, and they can look like ordinary people because they, believe it or not, have some degree of empathy. They just don't have any compassion. In other words, they feel the feelings of other people enough to take advantage of them, to know how to show what looks like care, but then they don't care about the person. They take advantage of them. But then there's the other subtype that has more of what we call like a schizoid core, a more authentically odd, less physical mannerisms, more flatness of the affect. And people like that are the kind of people that are sometimes described, particularly when there's criminal offenses, that are described as being creepy or odd or weird or giving somebody the heebie-jeebies or something when you're around them, because there's something off about that lack of human body movement and eye movement and facial expression. And I think sometimes that's what people are talking about when they see someone. But this is very complicated because there are a lot of reasons why a person could do that, could limit their bodily and facial range of feelings. For example, trauma. Sometimes people can look very shut down. For example, I thought it was very upsetting when the hunt was on for a suspect in the Idaho case, where there was a lot of blaming on the part of the public of people that knew the victims and so forth. And they would say, but they look so expressionless. How could they be so expressionless if they're not involved in some way in the crime? And the answer is sometimes people have been through a traumatic thing and their affect is limited because they're overwhelmed emotionally. So that I think you can't make too many judgments about that. Now, one question that lingered in my mind from the list that Ann and I had put together, and we've pretty much covered everything. It's been such a wonderful thing to interview you, Kerri. Is I'm confused about something. Your father seems to be capable of forging meaningful relationships with women. For example, Dr. Ramsland has been mentioned quite a number of times. I don't really know how the marriage was between your parents before this discovery, but I guess what I want to know is, do you think that your father hated women? Was he a misogynist? You mentioned that he might have chosen women almost as a matter of convenience. And I thought that was fascinating. That is the first time I have ever heard that said about your father. And it's particularly interesting for people like us who are trying to understand people who commit serial sexual homicide, because it's so unusual for them not to be misogynistic. So I'm curious, what is your thought about that, and particularly as a woman who was close to your father? What are his feelings about women?
Well, there seems to be some sort of issues with his mother. Of course, that didn't come out till Ramsland's book. As I was saying earlier, he goes back to maybe he felt abandoned or mistreated when he was younger. There's sort of a physical appearance similar to my grandma Dorothea, to Mrs. Hedge, my neighbor he murdered. Um, Sort of the same glasses and hair, was there some sort of subconscious fixation there? Now my father calls his seventh murder, Nancy Fox, his perfect murder, because it was that night he had full control over the situation. She was attractive. He got to spend his time with her. That was probably one he was recreating after that, honestly. I mean, honestly, he probably was actually recreating that one possibly in his last three. He didn't care for the one where he had to do the stabbing that got all messed up, got out of his plans. And he didn't care necessarily that much for the earlier 77 one, because there were children present. Now, in his first murders, he, strangled the children. In 77, he locked them in a bathroom and did not harm them physically. So that's a very interesting change there with my father after my brother was born. I'm assuming that influenced that, but we don't know for sure. My father had a very loving relationship primarily with my mother. He bombed her though. After they were only dated for like 9 months. She never really had dated anybody else. Her family, both the families went to church. Everybody knew each other. There was no yellow flags even with my father. Everybody loved him. You would have thought he was the best husband ever, the way he took her to movies and dates and vacations and took care of her. I mean, it was a very traditional, like mom did work out of the home, but she cooked, and cleaned, and dad cleaned, and very traditional. So I wouldn't, it's interesting that my father was able to maintain work, maintain natural relationships, not get arrested, but others have. D'Angelo's one that's similar to my father, criminal justice, having a family, long time, could stop. Those are two that are similar to me. But there were issues more with control. It's all about control. Like, he wanted me to stay perfect and not be scarred because he didn't think I would be attractive if I was scarred. Again, I said he didn't like us being injured. There was a little bit of a different treatment there towards me than my brother. But you have to realize my father never thought of his victims as full people. Like, there was no relationship there. And my father did have the ability to bond, I believe, to my family and people that were in my father's intimate circle, and he was very protective of us. It wasn't, all the textbooks are going to tell me that it was an act and a pretend, but I think it was legit and real. My father calls it cubing with Ramsland, so he calls it putting, like a cube, you switch the sides, so he could switch what side he wanted you to see. Some people call it putting on masks or taking them off. But my father would say he was always BTK, he was always Denis Rader. He could just show you who he wanted to, so he was in control of it. But I honestly do believe when my father and I were hanging out, he wasn't necessarily going in his head, oh my God, I'm BTK. I think he was just enjoying watching football or whatever he was doing. But he would have to answer that.
Well, it's a very powerful answer, because if I follow what you're really teaching us, is that it was more about control than it was about the victim being a woman. That women were chosen simply under the umbrella of feeling like you were looking for something or someone to completely control, and he had some idea that women would be easier targets, but he wasn't necessarily interested in sexual gratification or any other kind of gratification related to women per se. That's very unusual and very interesting.
All of his artwork, though, pre-arrest was women. I don't think there's any bondage with men that I know of. So it's all like sexy women and breast and nakedness. So, his BTK symbol, the B is boobs upside down like this, with a T like a knife, like penis or whatever he would call that. So I do think women or where he was sexually interested in. But there are reports like that he rather enjoyed the torture of the little boy. Sat in a chair and watched him suffocate. They have a chair imprint in the carpet, so
Oh,
there's
pretty
like this
disturbing.
driving sexual sadistic force in my father that I would have. My father was the most, at times, mellow, boring, precise, particular white bread man. So as a 26-year-old having to read about my father's sexual sadistic pleasures, that's kind of a mind twist. I can handle it better now, but it's taken a good deal of therapy to even be able to say BTK and then be able to talk like I am now. So
Right. Well, it's interesting. Ann and I, as we speak, are working on a grant with Dr. Petreka, Victor Petreka, on strangulation, on people who engage in that particular act. And one of the questions that has arisen is, are people who go on to commit serial killing, let's say, or other kind of murder, one-time murder or mass murder, with a strangulation involved, are they more prone to demonstrate that kind of behavior in a domestic violence kind of situation? Do they explode and engage in that kind of intimate, aggressive action? And unless I'm mistaken, I think you alluded to an incident of strangulation in the home. And I think it would be interesting to ask a little bit about that. I had never heard about that incident before. And it is very consistent with the kinds of things we see in people who engage in strangulation. And I wonder what you could tell us about
um
that incident.
yeah, twice. It was both times my brother. My father never laid a hand on me other than maybe when I was young, spanking. But my father wasn't very touchy feely. We were not a very touchy feely home. I would see him hug my mom. Um, and there's pictures of me like sitting close to my father and stuff, and we would hug. But in 96, my young cousin, she was 20, she had died in a Jeep accident. And I had been to college for a week. My dad's father was dying of leukemia. So again, my father was grieving and suffering, and we all were grieving. And I come home from college, and my mom had made a nice manicotti dinner, like from scratch, because that's who my mom is after working all day. I am not that person, by the way. And we had sat down. My brother was still living at home, so I was 18, he was 21. This was before the Navy, and we were sitting down to dinner, and we were all sort of stressed end of the week, grieving with my cousin, worried about my grandpa. We had an old rickety table. We never had very much money. We got into some kind of argument. For the life of me, I don't remember what. Somebody pounded on the table. Very well could have been me. I have a temper. I have my father's temper to a degree. And the table broke, the metal legs broke, and the pasta and the red sauce, everything went all over the kitchen floor. And my father sprung. So okay, here's what's really freaky about being somebody's kid. Like, I sort of look like him. People always tell me that I look like my mom, but I can physically feel him. Like, I'll be doing something and then I'll be like, oh my God, I just did that like my dad, or like my mom, like I sound like my mom. And then I'll be like moving like my father. So I literally, like, in my head can move like my father, like in a crime scene. It's messed up. So like he sprung out of the chair and he lunged for my brother face on. And my brother's taller than my dad by a few inches. And he wrapped his hand around my brother's neck. And at that moment, my dad's eyes were green. They got very dark, very beady, very mean. I've only ever seen that like one other time when he was very mad at me when I was cussing at him as a teenager, and he went after me and all. My mom got in the way, saved me a few minutes. He tried to kick down my door. So he had that. It was just like this seething, nasty, angry, barely in control layer right under those very thick attempt layers of being social and accepting, you know, like so much control to keep that, whatever that is, that some people would call monstrous or evil. I don't like the word evil, but in him, and it just comes out like, and it took my mom and I to push him off my brother. My mom very firmly says, go outside now. Because she actually could control my dad. And I don't even know what happened to my brother. I helped my mom clean up. We never talked about that night. We did not call the police. He worked with the local police. We never called the police. We never told anybody ever. Would I have said before my father was arrested that we were a domestic abuse family? Absolutely not. Would I have said we were an emotional abuse family, verbally abused? Absolutely. Mentally abused? Absolutely. No way in hell. No way in hell. Because most of the time he was this really amazing father. And then a few years later, again, with my brother, they got into it in the kitchen. Again, I'm telling you, it's inside in tight spaces. He doesn't like those. He went after my brother the same exact way, full lunge onto his throat. We pushed him off. And then my brother moved out not long after that. And it was basically like a control thing. Like my dad had to be in control. And here's this taller adult male in his house. But
Yeah.
I suppressed it. I suppressed those. Didn't tell my husband. Didn't tell anybody. Totally almost forgot. Then I found out that dad's BTK. BTK strangles women. Oh yeah. Hey dear. Dad tried to strangle my brother twice. You know, like that was.
Right.
I literally think I had forgotten that.
Well, it's a profound description, and it really speaks to somebody who, at moments of loss of control, almost became slightly pulled the curtain away and showed what he sort of felt like he needed to be when things were out of control. So that, for example, in the first murder, one almost gets the sense that when he felt that he couldn't assert control over a family, his own family, because of the loss of income and so forth, he found a perverse way to assert control over another family. And one wonders, thinking about how traumatic memories or flashbulb kind of things work in the brain, you almost wonder if the sight of all of the red sauce on the floor after the incident caused some kind of memory of blood or some other kind of thing. One doesn't know what would trigger that kind of moment of exploding into just a little bit of BTK.
Mm-hmm.
But the way you describe it is so profound, and I think is so rich in helping us understand those little moments where the split kind of comes a little bit, it gets bridged just a little bit, and then you say, who is this person? This is so terrifying. And then imagine discovering, once the curtain is completely pulled away, that the person is that dark person a lot of the time. I can just imagine. Anne, did you have any questions about that incident? It's a very rich story.
It is. Also, I wanted to ask Kerri, if your mother had not intervened and ordered your father out of the house, do you think your father would have not been able to stop himself with his son?
It was almost like he went into a trance.
Yeah.
I think some criminals, talk about going into these like.
They do.
So trance is not that my father has schizopathic tendencies, and my father didn't do any sort of drugs. He would have been appalled at somebody doing drugs before committing a crime. And the most my father ever touched was a bit of alcohol. He never liked to lose that control, so he would have never gone drunk. But it was almost like he went into something else, and it's exactly like Gary said, where the veil was lifted and you see a little bit of a glimpse.
Yeah.
Those moments of specifically, there I was knocking people about eyes, but specifically it's my father's eyes. They do this very deep, like dark, very scary, absent place that you do not want to be anywhere near a person that looks like that when they're like that. And it was like he had gone into a trance, lost control, forgot who he was in a room with, forgot it was my brother. And it took us breaking that trance. And then it was like he was ashamed. Now, would people argue with me that my father could feel shame? Has he ever felt shame after after he was arrested? I don't know. But it was almost like he was embarrassed. But maybe he was just embarrassed that he had lost control, not about what he had done.
Yeah, because it was a dinner dish, right? Can you think of anything that I know it's a loss of control, but what it symbolized? I know you said he never liked blood. I think Gary's point about it.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. So his only bloody crime scene was Catherine Bride. He stabbed her several times and he was covered in blood. And he had to take the clothes off, and he supposedly hid them in his parents' chicken coop and then went back. He has a whole thing with chickens. I don't know.
It was back to watching the chickens get
Murdered. Well, dinner.
Right, dinner. There you are. There's a link, dinner. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It was just my father explains in Ramsland's book, it's like a boiling pot that could normally keep under control through drawings and bondage and stalking, and then occasionally it would boil up. So I think it was just a compounding grief. But honestly, I mean, maybe it was because I was gone for a week, but I never even associated the blood. That's very interesting. Adds to my education over here. So, I mean,
was there anything else about that evening? You were all there for dinner, right?
No, I had just come home from college, and I don't know what we were arguing about. You know, I know it had to have been grief fed.
That's your
Yeah. One interesting thing, though, when we were talking on the side of before murder, of being depressed and bored, and he would call it idle hands, like devil's hands, like he would just go back to those bad places. Of course, then this is even an issue of control where he's not controlling his own pathological behavior that he's well aware of. After specifically Davis murder in 91, his mood improved. You know, he was more settled. Our house was calmer. We didn't have, there wasn't any of that churning in him or in my house. It was a release. It was always he would call it a sexual release, but it was always a release of whatever was in him like this.
Yeah.
He let it would go, and he would take it out on some poor innocent person. And, you know, Kohberger's colleagues at school are reporting that there was a change in his mood.
Right.
I'm sorry, Ann, I'd like to just pop in with, I have one final question for me that just came to my mind. And then I think, if you have anything else pressing, we can ask, but what I'd love to do is just go around the horn after I ask this question, starting with Gary, then Ann, and then Kerri, and maybe you guys can tell us what your, key takeaway was. But Kerri, I'm curious, in a hypothetical situation, Brian Kohberger is sent to the same prison as your father, and there's side-by-side cells. What do you think your father, BTK, would say to BCK?
Oh, I mean, if you look at how my father has talked about, my father studied crimes when he was young, going back to like the 40s and the 50s. He was very turned on by, like I said, those pulp magazines and certain cases. He doesn't like the Zodiac. Sometimes people think he was the Zodiac, and I'm like, the timeline doesn't match. My father was overseas. My father's not the Zodiac just because my father tried to make some codes. My father's no cryptographer like the Zodiac. Don't give him that credit. But my father sort of just doesn't ever want to even talk about the Zodiac. I don't know why, but there's certain criminals that he finds more interesting, or the big one in Chicago. I'm sorry, I don't know the one from a long time ago. He was very fascinated with his House of Horrors. Very fascinated with Jack the Ripper. Oh my God, like love Jack the Ripper. Growing up, he loved the movie where the House of Wax. We would have to watch that. That movie's horrifying. Hitchcock, Psycho. We watched there were certain things my father just loved. And earlier you were talking about wanting to leave things around that we would find. I think he was trying to share a little bit of his inner demons with me, with sharing certain movies with me. Stephen King was huge. Um, wanting to kind of let me get up close to that monster and understand my father better. This is by the time I was 12, I was reading Stephen King. We were passing books and discussing them, and my father wanted to know, how did they make me feel? Like Kiss the Girls. There's this really awful scene in Kiss the Girls, and my father wanted to know how I felt while reading that. He wanted to experience that. So if you were putting Kohberger and my father together, I'm sure my father would want to know the details and how it made him feel, and maybe tell him that he enjoyed hearing about it, maybe not because of the MO. You would have to go back and dig through Ranson's book to find out where all those attractions are, but they're multi-layered of what my father found or finds fascinating and interesting. The problem with my father is that he has a tendency to sometimes now incorporate other people's work into his own, and he gets a little confused about what was him and what was somebody else. But I don't think so. My father actually has, we would say somebody like my father doesn't have moral lines, but my father would want to make it clear that he never raped. That was very important to my father. Now, he masturbated on victims, possibly while they were dying or after. But it was a very immature sort of reaction. My father has a line he would not cross, and rape is one of my father's few lines, as odd as that sounds.
Do you think he would have scoffed at Brian, just the fact that he got caught relatively so quickly? Your father was able to get away with these crimes for 30 years. In the perverse sense, would he have been impressed with Brian Kohberger or embarrassed at how poorly he performed?
Oh, to pretend I'm my father, he would probably be talking about the hot chicks that got it, the hot sorority girls, college girls. I mean, some poor college girl sent me a letter a couple of years ago wanting to authenticate it from my father. He had taken an interest in her because she'd gone to the same college as me, and I was like, you poor thing. Do you realize if he got out, he would murder you? I mean, even he would murder Dr. Ramsland. That would probably be his number one choice. If we're talking sort of about a Hannibal Lecter scenario, another famous movie we watched together. So the thing is, you've got to realize, and it just sort of came to me today, somebody asked, if my father had never communicated with the police again in 2004, I don't think he would have been caught then, but he would be caught now due to genetics, I'm sure, if somebody in my family had submitted our DNA. So you can't really necessarily compare these big monster, infamous Bundys and Raders and D'Angelos to the guys now. You can't compare them to the Kohbergers because you've got genetic technology and out in a van, right? You got genealogy, and somebody was saying how quick it can be done. You can't commit the perfect crime. Maybe back then you can commit the perfect crime, and of course there's crimes all the time being unsolved today, but I don't think you can commit the perfect crime. And if Kohberger thought he was pulling that off in a house with a knife, he's crazy.
Gary, your final thoughts, Gary, and your key takeaway?
I'm going to attach this to my final thoughts then. I will say that one of the things I was thinking about when Kerri was explaining that is, for those of us who study the history of crime, there's been this question, why was there such an explosion of serial killing in the Western world, particularly the US, from the 1960s to 1990s, and then a decline, where it's been sort of replaced by mass murder, mass shootings especially, as the more common of the atrocities that we see over serial killing. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It has to do with the technology that leads to people being captured before the cooling off period ends and they go out and commit the offense again. And that is why Ann and I happen to be people who study the offenses of mutilation and dismemberment, which are words we help to distinguish in literature, actually. And one of the things we learned, I think, is that because of the technology where it's easier to identify victims and catch people, you're seeing a lot more extreme butchery or even burning of victims to eliminate evidence. And this is something that years ago might have been thought of as a kind of a sign of disorganization or lunacy or, being enraged, but sometimes it's the pragmatic thing of just simply trying to get rid of traces. And that's an unfortunate thing. I think that's a result of this kind of race against the technology that we're seeing in offenders. What I would say in terms of final thoughts is that, first of all, we went to some pretty difficult and dark places in this interview, and it was extraordinary to hear things from your side. I think that there will be thousands of people listening to this interview. Some of them are people who will have been family members of people who committed offenses or were victims of violent crime. And I think that you have a very powerful message for them. I think especially the idea that you engage in advocacy and you sort of share your experiences with other people. This is an enormous thing. And one of the things I keep thinking about as I'm listening to you is putting myself into your shoes is what must be so difficult is when you love somebody that has done something that makes them so odious. What are you supposed to feel about them? And I know, having interviewed people who have committed atrocious acts, that sometimes they're likable, and I'll step away from them and I'll feel a kind of an anger at myself that I found them likable. And it is a weird phenomenon in human beings that we can kind of fragment like that. And I guess maybe it's something you could speak about a little bit, but it must be a terrible conflict to love somebody who also has done such awful things.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
and I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I'm tired and it's been a long day, but so of course now here comes the waterworks. Um, but I mean, I loved him beyond words. Even with everything I've said, everything you don't know, what I still endure. I mean, I literally have night terrors every night. Nobody, I've talked to criminologists, law enforcement, nobody's been able to help me. I've had them since the murder of my neighbor, probably somewhere in there. Maybe I've had PTSD since I was little. Lord only knows. As much as I can still suffer, I still, at the very core, love my father because I cannot not love the man I knew pre-2005. And I tried very hard for 16 years to love him to the best of my ability. And then I had to cut him off, but I still love him. But I've never been able to speak to him on the phone since his arrest. The last time I saw him was 2004. I can't handle this voice. It's traumatic. I've never visited him because maybe I've also kind of dealt with it as like he's not really alive. And day to day, as much as intense as this conversation is day to day, I am a pretty normal person. And I am at a point now I forget who my dad is, or I'll forget about dad completely. And then I'll be walking along and then I'll be like, oh crap, dad's BTK. Or, oh, is dad really BTK? And then there's this little thing in your brain going, yes, you goofy, that's your dad. So that's how much I can still sort of just pat around that and be normal. That, oh yeah, dad's bad, BTK, great, But I mean, I get knocked for saying I love this man or trying to explain who he was outside of the psychopathy. But I think one of the main reasons I am speaking up and trying to educate and trying to build relationships with criminologists is because we're missing that component of humanness and realness, and maybe we don't really want to have to face the fact that these people can be fully human and fully monstrous. Maybe we just can't wrap our sane brains around that. And maybe we're missing something in the fact that they can be human. I don't know.
It's an extraordinary statement, because I think we do like, as people, to think that people who do bad things day in and day out are like Mephistopheles, sitting, tapping their fingers together like a villain. And I think what's far harder is to realize that there can be very long wide patches of what looks like humanity, what is humanity in people, and it's very difficult and very dark to understand that. So that was an incredibly profound thing to share, and I appreciate it so much. I'll hand you to Anne for her final thoughts.
Sure. Kerri, thank you so much for this interview. This has been incredibly, and I hope that you will, and Joel will give us permission. I'd love my students to be able to see this.
Oh, yes.
So that will be, thank you. But, you know, I had as you're in describing this has so much implication for prevention, which I think you also are trying to help us with. And which we tried to get at some of the possible things there that might have helped you prevent or get your father some help so that he didn't have to do the horrible things. That's always something that we aim for. But I think all of your being able to talk about how much you did love him, certainly for the up until you found out about what he had done, is very human and very genuine. But then how you had to handle that 10% of the BTK, which I think you do in your book, is very, very interesting, that you kind of can overcome the 10% because you have the 90% where that you knew him, and you really had sounds like a very good relationship with him and the family and so forth. That you didn't know that was helpful, I guess. But at any rate, I just think that this is in so many ways so enlightening. And I've never heard anybody that has gone through what you've gone through to be able to talk about it so clearly. And I really commend you for that. And I'm so glad you shared this with us. And I know my students will too. Maybe we'll Zoom you in to say hi to them sometime.
Yeah, anytime.
Yeah.
I do want to add on what Gary was saying about the offenders, the big guys from the 70s versus now. My sort of layperson thought is maybe these guys are getting mental help and psychological help and therapy, and if they're becoming delinquents, they're getting redirected early. As I said earlier, my father very likely had oppositional defiance and conduct disorder. He was raised by pretty strict parents that used to switch. Some of that stuff maybe comes back into how he then reacted in his murders. We just parent differently. As somebody that, I had some educational difficulties early on. I didn't get any help in school. My kids have an abundance of help. Medical assistance, educational support, labels, teams of people. I mean, none of this existed in the 40s when these kids were being born. There could be something too to say about these people being raised in a certain sort of expected structure, or maybe being born to post-war parents. You've got to imagine their fathers came back with trauma. Did anybody know that these people came back from the war with trauma? I think there was just a lot of family dynamics too. If you look at the big ones, Kemper and Bundy and things. I mean, you can dig back and find these disorganized relationships where there should have been a stereotypical relationship. Of course, my father came out of a normal one. I think it's a combination of education and help, and as you said, technology, and maybe just some sort of shift in society. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, there's something that's happened that's causing the mass murders. There's some sort of shifts, but I'm not the person to understand that.
Kerri, I just want to thank you. I know you were kind of responding to Gary there. If you have a final thought, please feel free to share it. If not, you can wrap it right up. But I don't want to chip you out of that.
I don't know. I mean, it's a lot, but I had to finally reach a point about 7 years ago. Well, basically, I was dying and rotting inside when I was not talking for the first 10 years. So I literally was crumbling inside. And when I forgave my father, my husband said I came back sort of to Kerri. I was BTK's daughter, but I still kind of go back and forth there. But I'm becoming more and more Kerri now as I fight and talk. Talking helps. I never expected it to help me, but as soon as I started opening my mouth and people can deal, people like Ann and Gary and you're rare, you're special because you can deal with somebody like me and you're not making the funeral face and you're not asking me to be quiet and you're not telling me I'm scaring you and to shut up or you're blaming me or something. So it's been an immense gift to me to be able to speak and meet, journalists that can deal, therapists that can deal, because I have to screen my therapist before I even start. Can you handle my father? Because there's some that cannot. Can you handle what I'm about to bring in here? It's been a gift to be able to finally get to talk to criminologists and be treated with respect and equality. But I just had to get to this place before all of this writing and education and speaking as a survivor in a general sense to anybody. I just had to get to a place to accept, okay, this really awful, horrible crap has happened. What am I going to do about it? I can't go back in 1974 with a time machine and stop my father. If I could, then I wouldn't be alive. My kids wouldn't be alive. So let's not go down that road anymore. So what am I going to do with it today? What am I going to do with it tomorrow? What am I going to do with it? I've got to do something good. And maybe I have this innate, insane drive to make a difference, to make up for my father. I can't bring those 10 people back. I can't bring back that loss, but what can I do with it? So I guess the most insane thing to think about is that my psychopathic, awful, god awful father gave birth to me. So I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. Like what? That's not, I mean, that's what's happened. So I just fight now. And most of the time I'm not fighting on camera. I'm not fighting, I'm just fighting through everything. And just, I refuse to give up. So he can deal with it or not deal with it.
Yeah. But remember that your speaking about this contributes to a knowledge base that helps people like us to try to put a stop to the next person to do something like this. And I have no doubt that if it weren't for people who contributed information to people who pioneered this kind of work, including Anne, and the generations that have come since that build on that work, I think there are some people who wouldn't be alive today. I think that some people were captured, incarcerated because of people who did that. Yeah. And I think you have to see it that this is your contribution to undoing the hideousness of what your father introduced into the world. You're sort of not allowing that light to get smothered. It's just a tiny little thing, and you're sort of bringing it back to a flame, a larger flame. And that's why I commend you so much. I think the fact that you do the work you do, the altruism, and this whole is an extraordinary way of undoing that ugliness. And it's very moving because some people don't get to a place where they say, "Let me do something with this for the world," And as the Talmud famously says, "He who saves one life saves the world entire." And I have no doubt that this work ultimately does save lives. So thank you for contributing to that.
I guess what's hard for me is somewhere along the line when I was young, my father knocked holes into me. You said it was sort of like soul sucking, and maybe I will explore that in my own processing. but being an abuse survivor of some degree, there's holes knocked into me. 5 million people can tell me I'm doing good. It doesn't stick. I don't know why. So it just sucks. But, I'm trying.
Kerri,
So,
I tell you, I have worked in broadcast news with some of the biggest names for 25 years and haven't come across someone as articulate as you. This is super powerful. I know it's very emotional.
it's
So,
okay.
yeah, an
I
immense
just get
thanks.
this way at the end of it. So,
That's a,
uh,
you can always cry on our show.
oh yeah, it's sort of my standard. But no, I really appreciate Anne and Gary and your time and reaching out to me. It meant a lot to me. Means a lot to me that somebody's willing to listen to me and educate me. That's huge because I want to keep learning and making an impact here. So
You're educating
You can
us.
stay in touch with us,
yeah,
and don't you think we can invite Kerri to stay in touch with us and to
Absolutely.
help in some ways with the work that we do?
please. Yeah, that would mean a lot.
Love to.
So I just want to say, giving an immense thanks to Kerri Rawson, so generous with your time, telling a story that no one should ever have to tell, but doing it with such grace, bravery, and eloquence on this special episode of Surviving the Survivor. And of course, thanks to the godmother of criminal profiling, Dr. Anne Burgess, and to Dr. Gary Bricado, two of the most powerful minds in psychological profiling, especially of serial killers. We're going to start a GoFundMe to get Gary a good microphone. Everyone out there, please chip in, maybe a dime a person to get it done. And we'll be back with another episode of Surviving the Survivor, which, according to the godmother, is now required viewing, at least in Boston College.
That's right.
Love you, America.